Her best friend's last wish was a sacred promise, to take care of my husband and help him heal. But as they built a memorial garden together in the lingering silence of their luxurious estate, she discovered the one rule she should never break: not to fall in love. Subscribe and comment on which city you are watching from. Let's continue. The air in Kaelin Sterling's home was thin and cold, tasting of marble and unspoken grief. Elara Vance stood in the cavernous foyer, her fingers clutching the strap of her worn leather satchel. Rain whispered against the grand floor-to-ceiling windows, each drop a ghost of the promise she'd made to Serafina. It had been 3 months since the funeral, 3 months of silence from him, and a lifetime of weighing that final whispered request in her own heart. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath, a monument of minimalist luxury frozen in time. She traced the vein of grey in the white marble floor with the toe of her boot, a stark contrast to the vibrant, chaotic life Serafina had filled these halls with. Elara could almost hear the echo of her friend's laughter bouncing off the cold, austere walls, a sound that now felt like a violation of the tomb-like quiet. Kaelin's housekeeper had let her in, her eyes soft with a pity that made Elara's skin prickle. He was in the West Wing, she had said, in the room that was supposed to be their future. Elara's own breath felt loud in the stillness. She carried with her a roll of architectural blueprints, the paper aged and softened at the edges. It was their project, Serafina's dream, a glass conservatory, a winter garden, a place where life could bloom even in the coldest months. Kaelin had designed it, Serafina had dreamt it, and Elara was supposed to help pick the flowers. Now it felt less like a dream, and more like an impossible, painful task she had no right to complete without its heart. She walked slowly, her footsteps echoing softly. The corridor was lined with art, abstract canvases of muted tones that seemed to absorb all light and emotion. This was Kaelin's world, a world of clean lines, controlled environments, and deep, contained sorrow. He was an architect who built beautiful, impenetrable fortresses, and Elara realized he had done the same with himself. The man she was about to face was not the man who had laughed by Serafina's side. She found him in a study overlooking the storm-tossed sea. He wasn't looking at the view. He was staring at a single framed photograph on his vast, empty desk. It was of Serafina, her smile so radiant it felt like a star collapsing in the dim room. Kaelin didn't turn as Elara entered, but she saw the muscles in his shoulders tighten beneath his expensive cashmere sweater. The air crackled with a tension that was more than just grief. It was a profound resistance. He finally looked up, his eyes the color of a winter storm, deep gray and turbulent. They held no recognition, only a weary emptiness that seemed to swallow her whole. He saw her, but she felt as if he were looking straight through her, seeing only the ghost of the woman who connected them. It was in that moment she understood the true weight of her promise. She wasn't here to help him build a garden. She was here to convince a man who had lost his son to feel its warmth again, and in that cold, silent room, she felt the first terrifying whisper of failure. Elara. Kaelin's voice was a low rasp, unused and rough, as if the word itself was an effort. He didn't stand. He simply gestured to the chair opposite his desk, a sleek, uncomfortable-looking piece of furniture that felt more like an interrogation seat than an invitation. The space between them felt like miles of frozen tundra. This was the forced proximity she had dreaded, a closeness that only highlighted the immense distance that now separated their worlds, once so tightly woven by a single person. She sat, placing the rolled blueprints on the polished mahogany surface. The sound was a soft thud that seemed to shatter the silence. She watched his eyes flicker to the roll, a muscle in his jaw tightening. This was the heart of the matter, the tangible piece of the future he had lost. Elara's hands felt cold, and she tucked them in her lap, feeling like an intruder in his perfectly curated sanctuary of pain. His world of luxury romance had become a gilded cage. "I know this is difficult," she began, her voice softer than she intended. "I wouldn't be here if Serafina hadn't made me promise." The words hung in the air, heavy and inadequate. A promise seemed like such a small, fragile thing in the face of his monumental loss. The scent of old books and expensive cologne filled the room, a scent that was all Kaelin, grounded and masculine, yet now it carried a note of staleness, of a life paused. He said nothing. He just continued to stare at the blueprints, his expression unreadable. Elara pushed on, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. She wanted this place to be finished. She talked about it constantly, even at the end. She said it was where you two would grow old. The words were a knife, and she saw him flinch, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes. She had wounded him, and a wave of regret washed over her. But then, a flicker of something else crossed his face. Not anger, but a deep, resonant sorrow that seemed to pull the light from the room. He finally reached out, his long, elegant fingers slowly unrolling the plans. He wasn't looking at the architectural lines he had drawn. He was looking at the small, colorful notes scribbled in the margins, the joyful, looping handwriting that was pure Serafina. "Moonflowers here," one note read. "Kaelin, imagine us dancing under the glass roof in the rain." He traced the words with his thumb, a gesture of such profound tenderness that it made Ilara's breath catch in her throat. For the first time, she wasn't seeing the ruthless CEO, the powerful architect, or the grieving husband. She was seeing a man touching the last remnant of a conversation with the woman he loved. He was a protective hero without anyone left to protect. This slow burn of shared grief was the only thing connecting them now, and in that quiet, intimate gesture, she saw the first crack in his fortress wall. Weeks bled into a month of tentative progress. Their meetings became a strange, unspoken ritual. Ilara would arrive every Tuesday and Thursday, just as the afternoon light began to fade, casting long shadows across the estate. Kaelin would be waiting in the study, always with a fresh pot of coffee, its rich, dark aroma a stark contrast to the sterile air of the house. He never asked if she wanted any. A cup would simply be waiting for her, black and steaming, on a small table beside her chair. It was a silent, recurring gesture of civility in their sea of awkwardness. She learned the language of his silence. A tightened jaw meant a memory had surfaced, sharp and painful. A long, drawn-out sigh meant he was wrestling with a design element that was tied to a specific dream of Serafina's. Ilara, in turn, communicated through her work. She brought soil samples, catalogues of exotic plants, and sketches of foliage arrangements. She spoke of root systems and blooming cycles, focusing on the practical, tangible aspects of life, a gentle counterpoint to his overwhelming sense of finality. One afternoon, she presented him with a drawing of a queen-of-the-night cactus, a strange, gangly plant that blooms only once for a single night, with a breathtakingly beautiful and fragrant flower. "Serafina always wanted one," she said softly, not looking at him but at the delicate pencil lines of her sketch. She loved the idea of something so beautiful being so fleeting. She said it made it more precious. The words were meant for her friend, a quiet tribute. Kaelin was silent for a long moment. Ilara risked a glance at him. He was looking at the drawing, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I remember," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "She wanted to host a party, stay up all night with champagne, just to watch it open." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, so faint it was almost imperceptible, but it was there. It was the first one she had seen in months, and it struck her with the force of a physical blow. The air in the room shifted. It was a subtle change, like the pressure dropping before a storm. The shared memory, a happy one, had opened a door that had been sealed shut. For a brief, suspended moment, Serafina wasn't a tragic loss that separated them. She was a warm, vibrant connection, a bridge built of champagne promises and midnight flowers. This was the dangerous territory of their forced proximity, where grief could so easily be mistaken for intimacy. Ilara's heart did a strange, painful flip in her chest. She looked away, focusing on the rain that had started to streak down the window pane. The sound filled the growing silence between them, a steady, rhythmic drumming. She was intensely aware of him, of his presence in the room, of the way his gaze lingered on her drawing. The lines of their relationship, friend's widow, grieving friend, were beginning to blur at the edges. She felt a loyalty shift within her, a tremor she knew she couldn't take back. The construction of the conservatory began. The stark, clean lines of Kaelin's design started to rise from the earth behind the main house, a skeleton of steel and glass against the grey sky. The constant, low hum of machinery became the new soundtrack to their lives, a rhythm of progress that felt both hopeful and profane. Kaelin was on site every day, his presence commanding and precise. He moved with a renewed purpose, a man fluent in the language of structure and form. It was a world he could control. Ilara found her role shifting. She was no longer just the keeper of Serafina's floral wishes. but a collaborator. Kaelin would ask for her opinion on the tint of the glass, the placement of the irrigation systems, the texture of the stone for the pathways. He valued her knowledge, her illustrator's eye for detail and composition. The dynamic between them was changing from a painful obligation to a tentative partnership, a slow burn of professional respect. One blustery afternoon, she stood with him inside the unfinished structure. The roof was on, but the glass panels for the walls were not yet installed, leaving them exposed to the wind that swept in from the sea. It whipped a strand of her dark hair across her face, and before she could brush it away, Kaelin reached out. His fingers, warm and calloused from touching raw materials, grazed her cheek as he tucked the strand behind her ear. The gesture was brief, impersonal, yet it sent a jolt through her entire body. Her skin tingled where he had touched her. She froze, her breath catching in her lungs. His hand dropped away instantly, and he took a half-step back, his expression shuddering as if he too was surprised by his own unconscious action. The professional boundary they had so carefully constructed had just been breached, and the air crackled with the fallout. The luxury romance setting felt suddenly charged with an unexpected raw energy. "The wind," he said, his voice a little too rough. He cleared his throat and pointed towards the far end of the structure. "We need to consider the cross-ventilation for the tropicals." He was all business again, the architect, the man in control, but the moment lingered in the space between them, a silent, shimmering thing. It was the first time he had touched her, and the casual intimacy of it was more shocking than a shout. Ilara could still feel the phantom touch of his fingers on her skin, a warm imprint against the cold sea air. She nodded, unable to find her voice, her gaze fixed on the spot he was pointing to, though she saw nothing but the memory of his hand moving towards her face. The smell of the ocean, salt and rain and wild things filled her senses, mingling with the faint lingering scent of his cologne. She knew, with a terrifying certainty, that this was the moment everything had changed. That single, fleeting touch became a ghost that haunted their interactions. A new awareness settled between them, delicate and fraught with unspoken meaning. They were careful not to stand too close, their hands always occupied with blueprints or soil samples. Kaelin's gaze would sometimes meet hers across the steel framework of the conservatory, and in his eyes she saw a flicker of the same startled confusion that was churning inside her. It was a silent acknowledgement that a line had been crossed. Ilara tried to focus on the work, pouring her energy into creating the perfect environment for the plants that would soon fill the space. She spent hours researching, sketching, and planning, creating a symphony of green and blooming life on paper. It was a safe refuge, a way to channel the tumultuous emotions that were taking root in her heart. She was a guest in this billionaire romance, a simple artist in a world of unimaginable wealth and sorrow, and she felt dangerously out of her depth. One evening, working late in the study, she was so absorbed in a detailed sketch of an orchid that she didn't hear him approach. He placed a glass of water on the desk beside her, and she jumped, startled. Her hand slipped, sending a dark pencil line slashing across the delicate petal she had been rendering. A small, frustrated sound escaped her lips. "I'm sorry," she breathed, her cheeks flushing with color. "I didn't hear you." "My fault," Kaelin said, his voice a low rumble beside her. He didn't move away. He stood behind her chair, his presence a warm, solid weight in the quiet room. He leaned in slightly to look at her drawing, and she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Her pulse quickened. "It's beautiful," he murmured, his gaze on the intricate details of the flower. "You have her eye for beauty." The comparison to Serafina was both a comfort and a sting. He continued to look at the drawing, his proximity both unnerving and strangely comforting. This was the most dangerous kind of forced proximity, not of circumstance, but of choice. He could have retreated, but he stayed. Ilara was hyper-aware of everything, the soft material of his trousers brushing against her chair, the clean masculine scent of his skin, the quiet sound of his breathing. The air grew thick, charged with a current of unspoken electricity. She wanted to lean back, to close the small distance between them, an impulse so powerful and so terrifying that it made her hands tremble. She was falling, she realized, with a sickening lurch of her stomach. She was falling for the one man in the world she had no right to even think about, the one man who was completely and utterly off limits. The slow burn was becoming an inferno she couldn't control. He finally straightened up, moving away from her to stand by the window, breaking the spell. The tension eased, but the echo of it remained, vibrating in the air. Ilara stared at the ruined drawing, the black slash across the perfect orchid. It felt like a metaphor for what was happening to her heart, a beautiful, fragile thing being defaced by a feeling that was both wrong and undeniably real. She had to get out, but she didn't know how to run from her own heart. To escape the growing intensity, Ilara began taking long walks along the cliffside path that bordered the Sterling estate. The wild, untamed nature of the coast was a balm to her frayed nerves. The salty spray, the cry of the gulls, and the relentless crash of waves against the rocks were a powerful reminder that some forces were too big to be controlled. She would sit on a weathered bench overlooking the turbulent water, letting the wind whip the turmoil from her thoughts, trying to remember the simple loyalty that had brought her here. One late afternoon, she saw Kalen walking on the same path, his tall silhouette stark against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. He was walking away from the house, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket, his shoulders hunched against the wind. It was the first time she had seen him outside the context of the house or the conservatory. Here, he was just a man, stripped of his architectural armor, looking small against the vastness of the ocean. She could have turned back, retreated to the safety of the house, but her feet remained planted on the gravel path. He hadn't seen her yet. She watched as he stopped and looked out at the sea, his profile sharp and sorrowful. There was a profound loneliness about him that called to a place deep inside her, a place that had nothing to do with Serafina or promises, and everything to do with the man standing before her. He must have sensed her presence, because he turned his head slowly. Their eyes met across the distance. He didn't seem surprised to see her. A silent understanding passed between them. This cliffside was a place for ghosts, for memories, for feelings too large to be contained within four walls. He gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod, an invitation to share the space, if not the silence. This was a new level of forced proximity, one of shared solitude. She walked towards him, the sound of her boots crunching on the path the only noise besides the wind and waves. She stopped a few feet away, respecting the invisible boundary of his grief. They stood side by side, not speaking, watching the waves roll in and crash against the shore. The rhythm was hypnotic, a cycle of turmoil and retreat. It felt like watching their own hearts, the constant push and pull of what they felt versus what they believed they should feel. She loved this spot, Kalen said finally, his voice carried away by the wind. She called it the edge of the world. She said you could whisper your secrets to the ocean, and it would keep them safe. He turned his head to look at her, and in the fading light she saw a raw vulnerability in his eyes she had never seen before. I have so many secrets now, Ilara. His admission hung between them, a confession as vast and deep as the ocean itself. The confession changed the texture of their silence. It was no longer just awkward or grief-stricken. It was now filled with the weight of his secrets, secrets she had no right to know, but felt an overwhelming urge to understand. Their work on the conservatory continued, but the undercurrent of that cliffside moment was always there. The protective hero was showing his own wounds, and it made him dangerously human, dangerously real to her. Ilara found herself watching him more closely, noticing the small things. The way he rubbed the back of his neck when he was stressed, the way his eyes would soften when he looked at a particularly beautiful plant, the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow. These were the details that built a person, details Serafina had known intimately, and Ilara felt a pang of guilt with every new one she discovered. She was learning the map of a man who belonged to her best friend. One afternoon, a delivery of rare tropical ferns arrived. As they worked together to uncrate them, their hands brushed. It was an accident, a simple grazing of skin, but it sent a shockwave of awareness through them both. They both pulled back as if burned. Kalen cleared his throat, his focus immediately shifting to the delicate fronds of a fern, but Ilara saw the slight tremor in his hand as he reached for it. The air in the humid, warm conservatory grew thick with unspoken words. The scent of damp earth and exotic blossoms was intoxicating, a sensory overload that heightened every feeling. This glass house was becoming their world, a bubble where the rules of the outside didn't seem to apply. Here they were not just the grieving husband and the loyal friend. They were a man and a woman, building something beautiful together out of the ashes of a tragedy. Later that day, as she was preparing to leave, Kalen stopped her at the door of the study. "Ilara," he said, and she turned, her heart giving a nervous leap. "Thank you." The words were simple, but his tone was filled with a sincerity that made her look up. His eyes, usually so guarded, were open and direct. "For this. For not letting me drown." The admission was stark, a confession of his own weakness that he would show to no one else. "I promised," she whispered, the words feeling like both a shield and a cage. I promised her. It was a reminder, to him and to herself, of the ghost that stood between them, of the loyalty that was supposed to be her guide. But as she looked into his grateful eyes, she realized her reasons for being there were no longer just about the promise. They were about him. The slow burn was threatening to catch fire. He held her gaze for a moment longer, a silent, intense communication passing between them. The unspoken tension became a third person in the room, a constant companion in their work. It was in the way Kaylin would find excuses to be near her, adjusting a light fixture above her workspace or examining a plant she was sketching. It was in the way Ilara's breath would catch when he leaned over her shoulder, his clean, masculine scent enveloping her. This delicate dance of avoidance and attraction was exhausting, a slow burn that was charring the edges of her resolve. They found a fragile safety in routine, coffee in the morning, a shared, silent lunch in the vast, empty dining room, and long hours in the growing green world of the conservatory. They talked about the project, about botany, about architecture. They talked about everything except the one thing that truly mattered, the shimmering, dangerous energy that pulsed between them whenever they were in the same room. Their forced proximity was no longer just about the house. It was an emotional state. One rainy afternoon, Ilara was perched on a ladder, carefully attaching an air plant to a piece of driftwood mounted high on a wall. The ladder wobbled on the uneven stone floor, and she let out a small gasp, her hand flailing for balance. Before she could fall, Kaylin was there, his hands closed around her waist, strong and steady, holding her secure. His touch was firm, grounding, a protective hero in his most elemental form. "I've got you," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her back. She was frozen, her hands gripping the ladder, her body pressed against his. She could feel the solid wall of his chest, the steady beat of his heart against her shoulder blades. Time seemed to stop. The only sound was the drumming of the rain on the glass roof and the frantic pounding of her own pulse in her ears. His hands didn't move. They stayed at her waist, a warm, possessive weight. She could feel the heat of his palms through the thin fabric of her shirt. It was a touch that was meant to be practical, a touch to save her from a fall, but it felt like so much more. It felt like a claim. A wave of dizziness washed over her, a heady mix of fear and a longing so intense it stole her breath. This was the moment she had been dreading, and, a secret, shameful part of her admitted, the moment she had been waiting for. He helped her down from the ladder, his hands lingering at her waist for a fraction of a second too long, after her feet were safely on the ground. When he finally let go, the sense of loss was sharp and immediate. They stood facing each other, the air between them thick with everything they couldn't say. His eyes were dark, searching hers for an answer to a question he hadn't dared to ask. The luxury romance setting had faded away, leaving only two people in a glass house, caught in a storm of their own making. She knew if he had leaned in then, she would not have been able to turn away. The aftermath of the ladder incident was a week of strained, meticulous politeness. They were like two magnets flipped to repel, creating a field of energy that was impossible to ignore. Kaylin became engrossed in the technical aspects of the conservatory's climate control systems, a problem he could solve with logic and engineering. Ilara retreated to the far corners of the garden, tending to the most remote plants, creating a physical distance to match the emotional one she so desperately needed. But the house was not large enough to contain the growing force between them. They would pass in a hallway, and the air would crackle. Their fingers would brush as they both reached for the same coffee pot, sending a jolt of electricity through them. Each accidental touch, each shared glance, was a small log thrown onto the slow-burning fire. Ilara felt like she was living a double life, the devoted friend honoring a promise, and a woman falling helplessly in love. One evening, exhausted, she fell asleep on the plush sofa in the study, a book of botanical plates open on her lap. She woke with a start, not knowing what had disturbed her. The room was dark, save for the soft glow of a desk lamp. A heavy cashmere throw had been draped over her. It wasn't hers. It smelled faintly of him, that familiar scent of cedar and clean linen. She sat up, her heart pounding. Kalen was standing by the window, looking out at the moonlit sea. He hadn't woken her. He had found her asleep, and instead of disturbing her, had covered her. A quiet, protective gesture that spoke volumes. He was a hero in the shadows, a man whose kindness was a secret language. He turned, seeming to sense she was awake. "I didn't want to wake you," he said, his voice soft in the darkness. "You looked peaceful." Peaceful was the last thing she felt. Her entire being was a tangled mess of guilt and desire. "Thank you," she whispered, her hand clutching the soft, luxurious fabric of the throw. "For the blanket." It was such an inadequate thing to say, but the real words were trapped in her throat, too dangerous to be spoken. This act of tenderness felt more intimate than any touch. He walked over and sat in the armchair opposite the sofa, not turning on any more lights. They sat in the semi-darkness, cocooned in a bubble of quiet intimacy. "Ilara," he began, his voice hesitant. "We need to talk." The words she had been dreading were finally here. She braced herself for the end, for him to tell her that this arrangement was no longer working, that her presence was a complication he couldn't afford. But when she met his gaze across the shadowed space, she saw no dismissal in his eyes, only a deep aching confusion that mirrored her own. "I don't know how to do this," Kalen confessed into the quiet darkness of the study. His voice was raw, stripped of its usual commanding tone. He wasn't looking at her, but at his own hands clasped loosely between his knees. "I feel like I'm betraying her every time I breathe, every time I feel anything other than grief." His words were a direct echo of the turmoil in Ilara's own soul. He was articulating the very guilt that had been her constant shadow. Ilara's heart ached for him, for them. "It's not a betrayal to heal, Kalen," she said, the words feeling fragile but true. "Serafina wouldn't want you to live in a mausoleum. She wanted you to live. That's what this garden is about. It's about life." She pulled the cashmere throw tighter around her, the scent of him a strange comfort as she navigated this treacherous emotional landscape. This was the conversation that would define everything. He finally looked up, and his eyes found hers in the dim light. "But what if what I'm feeling isn't about healing?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, a shimmering, terrifying thing. It was an admission, a confession that went far beyond the secrets he'd whispered on the cliffside. He was talking about them. He was talking about the electricity, the awareness, the impossible pull that existed between them. The slow burn had reached its flashpoint. There was no going back from this. The unspoken had been spoken, and the room was filled with its power. Ilara's breath hitched. She had no answer for him, only the frantic, undeniable truth of her own heart. She felt it too. It was a terrifying, beautiful, and utterly catastrophic feeling. She was drowning in this billionaire romance, and he was the only one holding out a hand. "When I'm with you," he continued, his voice gaining a desperate strength, "the silence in this house, it's not as loud. I feel a flicker of something I thought died with her." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his gaze intense. "And it terrifies me, Ilara, because sometimes, when I feel it, I forget to feel guilty." The honesty of his words was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. He was giving her all of his broken pieces, his confusion, his shame. He was trusting her with the one secret that could destroy them both. The protective hero was asking to be seen, to be understood. This was a deeper intimacy than a touch, deeper than a kiss. It was the bearing of a soul. She had come here to help him heal, but she had never anticipated that his healing would be so inextricably linked to her own heart, and she realized she was just as terrified as he was. After that night, the walls between them didn't just have cracks, they had gaping holes. Their shared confession, whispered in the dark, had created a new, fragile foundation. They still didn't touch, still didn't speak the name of the feeling that was growing between them, but it was there in every shared glance, every lingering silence. The work in the conservatory took on a different energy. It was no longer a memorial to a past love, but a sanctuary for a new, burgeoning one. The first delivery of flowers arrived, a riot of color and fragrance that flooded the glass house with life. As they worked side by side, potting orchids and training jasmine vines, their movements became a synchronized, unspoken dance. Kalen would hand her a tool just as she was about to ask for it. She would know, just by the set of his shoulders, that he was struggling with a memory, and would gently change the subject. They were learning each other's rhythms, the music beneath the words. One morning, while handling a particularly thorny bougainvillea, a thorn pierced Ilara's glove and pricked her finger. She hissed in pain, pulling her hand back. Instantly, Kalen was at her side, his expression clouded with concern. "Let me see," he said, his voice firm. Before she could protest, he gently took her hand in his thumb stroking over her palm as he examined the small wound. His touch was electric. The world seemed to narrow to the point of contact, the warmth of his skin against hers, the surprising calluses on his architect's hands, the sheer size of his hand engulfing her own. Her pulse hammered in her wrist, right beneath his thumb. He was so close she could see the flecks of silver in his grey eyes, could smell the faint scent of coffee on his breath. The protective hero was in his element, tending to her, and it was devastatingly potent. He carefully removed the thorn, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Better?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. He didn't let go of her hand. His gaze lifted from her finger to her face, and his eyes were dark with an emotion she couldn't name, but felt in every cell of her body. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of jasmine and damp earth and something else, something wild and elemental that was purely them. This slow burn was about to ignite. The moment stretched, suspended in time. His thumb continued its slow, hypnotic caress over her palm. He was looking at her lips, she realized with a jolt. His gaze was intense, hungry. The question from that night in the study hung between them, unanswered. What if what he was feeling wasn't about healing? It was about this moment, this undeniable, earth-shattering chemistry. He started to lean in, and her heart stopped. The sound of a heavy-duty truck backfiring on the main road shattered the moment like a pane of glass. Kalen flinched, dropping her hand as if it had burned him. He took a step back, running a hand through his hair, his expression a mixture of frustration and something that looked like self-reproach. The spell was broken, the fragile bubble of their intimacy popped by the intrusion of the outside world. Ilara's hand felt cold and empty without his. I should get the first aid kit," he stammered, his voice rough. He turned and walked away quickly, his long strides eating up the space between them, leaving Ilara standing alone amidst the blooming flowers, her heart still hammering against her ribs. She brought her finger to her lips, the spot where the thorn had been, and could still feel the phantom warmth of his touch. He had almost kissed her. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. The rest of the day passed in a blur of strained politeness. They were back to being careful. The memory of that almost kiss a raw exposed nerve between them. But something had irrevocably shifted. The possibility of it was now real, a tangible thing that lived in the air they breathed. The forced proximity of their work had led them to a precipice, and they had both stared down into the abyss. Ilara went home that night and couldn't sleep. She lay in her small, quiet apartment, a world away from the opulent luxury of the Sterling estate, and replayed the moment over and over in her mind. The look in his eyes, the feel of his hand, the way his body had inclined towards hers. It was a dangerous, addictive memory. She was playing with fire and she knew she was going to get burned. Her loyalty to Serafina was a constant aching pain in her chest. She could almost hear her friend's voice, a mixture of laughter and warning. What was she doing? How had she let this happen? But then she would remember the profound loneliness in Kalen's eyes, the quiet way he had covered her with a blanket, the vulnerability in his confession. She wasn't just falling for a handsome, wealthy man. She was falling for the broken, beautiful soul he had shown only to her. She had to make a decision. She could walk away, tell him she couldn't finish the project, and leave him to his ghosts. It would be the safe, honorable thing to do. It would also feel like cutting out a piece of her own heart, or she could stay and face the beautiful, catastrophic consequences of what was blooming between them in that glass house. She fell asleep just before dawn, with no answer, only the ghost of his touch on her skin. Ilara returned to the estate the next day with a heavy heart, her mind still a battlefield of conflicting emotions. She had decided nothing, only that she couldn't bear the thought of not seeing him again. As she walked up the long, winding driveway, she saw something that made her stop. Kalen was standing in the half-finished conservatory, not working, but simply standing in the middle of the space, his head tilted back as if soaking in the atmosphere. He looked different. The usual tension in his shoulders was gone. There was a lightness to his posture, a sense of peace she had never seen in him before. He was surrounded by the life they had brought into the space, the vibrant greens, the shocking pinks of the bougainvillea, the creamy whites of the orchids. The garden was no longer a skeleton. It was becoming a living, breathing entity, and it was changing him. She entered the conservatory quietly, not wanting to disturb his moment of reflection. The air was warm and humid, alive with the scent of blooming flowers and wet earth. It was their own private world, a pocket of impossible tropical beauty on the rugged, windswept coast. It was the world they had built, and it was a world where their feelings for each other were allowed to exist, nurtured by the same light and warmth as the plants. He turned, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face when he saw her. It wasn't the ghost of a smile she'd seen before. It was real, and it transformed his entire face, chasing the shadows from his eyes. "Look," he said, his voice filled with a quiet wonder. "The first jasmine flower opened this morning." He pointed to a delicate star-shaped white blossom on a climbing vine. She walked over to him, her resolve to keep her distance melting away in the face of his unguarded joy. They stood together, looking at the tiny flower as if it were the most miraculous thing in the world. Its fragrance was sweet and intoxicating, a perfume that seemed to amplify the intimacy of the moment. This was what Serafina had wanted, she thought with a pang. Life, beauty, a future. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She was suddenly overwhelmed by the complexity of it all. The beauty was born from tragedy. The joy was tinged with guilt. Her love for him was inextricably tangled with her love for her best friend. It was a messy, painful, and breathtakingly real feeling. The slow burn of their connection was finally blooming into something undeniable. "Not as beautiful as the artist who chose it," Kalen said, his voice a low murmur. He wasn't looking at the flower anymore. He was looking at her. His words hung in the fragrant air, a simple compliment imbued with a universe of meaning. Ilara's heart fluttered like a trapped bird against her ribs. He was closing the distance between them again, not with his body, but with his words, which were somehow more intimate, more binding. The professional lines were gone, washed away by a tide of emotion that was too strong to fight. She was no longer just the illustrator. She was the artist of his new reality. She couldn't look away from his gaze. It was intense, searching, and filled with an admiration that was purely for her. In his eyes, for the first time, she didn't feel like a shadow of Serafina. She felt seen, for herself, for the quiet strength he had witnessed, for the beauty she had cultivated in the midst of his sorrow. It was a powerful, addictive feeling, and it stripped away her last defenses. "Kalen," she breathed, her voice barely audible. It was a plea, a warning, a surrender, all in one. She didn't know what she was asking for, or what she was trying to prevent. She only knew that they were standing on the edge of something irreversible. The careful world she had constructed, built on promises and loyalty, was about to crumble. This billionaire romance was no longer a fantasy. It was her reality. He took a step closer, his presence filling her senses. The world outside the conservatory disappeared. There was only the warm, humid air, the scent of jasmine, and the man in front of her who had inexplicably become the center of her universe. The protective hero was no longer just protecting her from falling ladders. He was offering a sanctuary from her own loneliness. "I know," he said, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "I know all the reasons why we shouldn't. They march through my head every night, a constant parade of guilt and responsibility." He lifted his hand and his knuckles gently grazed her cheek, a touch as soft as a butterfly's wing. "But then, I see you here, in this place we built. And none of those reasons seem to matter as much as the one reason why we should." His touch was her undoing. A wave of warmth spread through her, chasing away the last of her resistance. What was the one reason? He didn't have to say it. She could see it in the depths of his storm-grey eyes. It was the same reason that was screaming in her own heart. It was the simple, terrifying, and undeniable truth that they had found in each other, a solace they had never expected. He leaned in slowly, giving her every chance to turn away, to stop him. She didn't turn away. She couldn't. Her feet felt rooted to the stone floor, her body swaying towards him as if pulled by an invisible string. This was it. the culmination of months of shared grief, silent understanding and simmering tension. The slow burn was over. The inferno was here. When his lips finally met hers, it wasn't a tentative, questioning touch. It was a kiss of profound, desperate certainty. It was a kiss that tasted of coffee and rain, and a loneliness so deep it mirrored her own. His lips were soft yet firm, moving against hers with a hunger that spoke of months of restraint. His hand moved from her cheek to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her hair, holding her to him as if he was afraid she might disappear. A small, helpless sound escaped her throat, and she melted into him. Her hands came up to rest on his chest, her fingers clutching the soft fabric of his shirt. She could feel the frantic, heavy beat of his heart beneath her palm, a rhythm that matched her own. The world outside their glass sanctuary ceased to exist. There was no past, no future, only this moment, this explosive, world-altering connection. It was a kiss that felt like a homecoming, a recognition of a soul she hadn't known she was searching for. He deepened the kiss, a low groan rumbling in his chest. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated relief, the sound of a man who had been starving and was finally being fed. All the unspoken words, all the stolen glances, all the pent-up emotion poured into that single, breathtaking kiss. It was a kiss of gratitude, of sorrow, of a hope so fragile it might break them both. It was the most beautiful and painful thing she had ever experienced. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. Kaelin's eyes were closed, his expression one of profound, agonizing relief. Ilara's world was spinning. The scent of jasmine was so strong it was almost dizzying. She had just kissed her dead best friend's husband, and the only thing she felt was a sense of rightness, a feeling so pure and absolute it defied all logic. "Ilara," he whispered, his breath warm against her skin. He opened his eyes, and the storm in them had calmed, replaced by a clear, shining certainty that stole her breath all over again. He had found his anchor in the tempest, and that anchor was her. The protective hero had finally found someone worth fighting for again, but as she looked into his eyes, a single cold thought pierced through the warm haze of the kiss. What have we done? The aftermath of the kiss was a deafening silence. The reality of what they had done crashed down on them, with the force of a physical blow. Kaelin dropped his hands and took a step back, the space between them once again feeling like a chasm. The certainty in his eyes was replaced by a wave of guilt so profound it was almost visible, a shadow that dimmed the light in the conservatory. He looked at her as if seeing her, and the ghost of Seraphina standing beside her for the first time. "I shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice rough with self-loathing. He wouldn't meet her eyes, instead focusing on a point over her shoulder. The words were a slap, a dousing of cold water on the fire he had just ignited. Ilara's heart, which had been soaring moments before, plummeted. She felt a flush of shame creep up her neck. She had been a willing participant. She had wanted it just as much as he had. "Kaelin," she started, but she didn't know what to say. There was no excuse, no justification that would make it right. They had crossed a line that should never have been approached, let alone obliterated. The beautiful, fragile thing that had bloomed between them was now tainted by the very betrayal they had sworn to avoid. The luxury romance had revealed its cruel, sharp edges. He turned away from her completely, walking to the far side of the conservatory and staring out at the grey, unforgiving sea. His shoulders were rigid, his posture radiating a mix of anger and regret. He was rebuilding his fortress, brick by painful brick, and she was on the outside. The intimacy they had shared, the confessions whispered in the dark, all of it felt like a dream she was waking from. The scent of jasmine, which had seemed so romantic moments ago, now felt cloying, suffocating. The beautiful glass house they had built together suddenly felt like a cage, its transparent walls exposing their guilt to the world. She felt a desperate need to flee, to run from the consequences of her own heart. The forced proximity that had nurtured their feelings was now a prison of shared shame. She watched his back, the tense line of his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. He was at war with himself, and she was the cause of it. The promise she had made to Seraphina lay in shards at her feet. She hadn't just failed to help him heal, she had become a part of a new wound, a new secret that would fester between them. She turned and walked out of the conservatory without another word, the sound of her footsteps loud in the sudden, terrible silence. Ilara drove away from the estate in a daze, the tires of her small car humming on the rain-slicked pavement. The world outside her windshield was a blur of green and grey. Her lips still tingled from the memory of his kiss, a phantom touch that was both a pleasure and a torment. His words, "I shouldn't have done that," echoed in her mind, each syllable a fresh twist of the knife. He regretted it. He regretted her. She spent the next 2 days in a self-imposed exile in her apartment. She didn't answer her phone, didn't check her emails. She just sat in her quiet living room, surrounded by her own botanical drawings, which now seemed to mock her. They were images of life, of beauty, but all she felt was a sterile emptiness. The slow burn had ended in a flash of brilliance, only to leave her in ashes. She thought about Serafina. She imagined her friend's reaction. Would it be the righteous anger of a betrayed wife, or would it be the sad, knowing pity of a woman who knew both of their hearts better than they knew themselves? Serafina had always been the pragmatic one, the one who saw the truth even when it was inconvenient. Had she in some way known this might happen? Had her promise been more than just a request to tend a garden? The thought was a dangerous one, a thread of hope that Ilara was afraid to pull. It was easier to drown in the guilt, to accept that what they had done was a monstrous betrayal. It was easier to believe that Kaylin's regret was the final word, that their connection was a beautiful mistake, destined to wither and die. This was the dark side of the billionaire romance, the emotional price for stepping into a world that wasn't hers. On the 3rd day, a courier arrived at her door. He delivered a single, large, flat box. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a framed botanical illustration. It was her drawing of the Queen of the Night cactus, the one she had shown him weeks ago. But it was different. In the bottom right corner, in Kaylin's neat architectural script, was a single word, Bloom. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a love letter. It was something more complex. It was a message, a plea, a command. It was a reference to their conversation, to Serafina's love for fleeting beauty, to the life they were supposed to be cultivating. It was his way of saying that what had happened between them, however complicated, was a form of life, a form of blooming in the dark. Her heart, which had felt like a stone in her chest, gave a painful, hopeful flutter. He didn't regret her. He regretted the pain, the guilt, the complication, but he didn't regret the feeling. The framed drawing was a silent invitation, a bridge across the chasm of their guilt. Ilara knew she had to go back. Walking away was no longer an option. Their story wasn't over. It had just reached its most difficult chapter. She drove back to the Sterling estate, her heart a tangled knot of apprehension and a fierce, determined hope. She found Kaylin not in the house, but on the cliffside path where he had first confessed his secrets. He was looking out at the ocean, his hands in his pockets, the wind whipping his dark hair around his face. He didn't seem surprised to see her. It felt as if he had been waiting. They stood in silence for a long moment, the roar of the waves filling the space between them. The air was clean and cold, a stark contrast to the humid, emotionally charged atmosphere of the conservatory. "I'm not sorry I kissed you, Ilara," he said, his voice firm and clear over the wind. He turned to face her, his eyes intense. "I'm sorry for how I reacted. I'm sorry for the pain it caused you. I was a coward. I let the ghosts win." His apology was direct, honest, and it healed a part of the wound his rejection had created. The protective hero was fighting again, but this time he was fighting his own demons. "I'm not sorry either," she confessed, her voice small but steady, "and I'm just as afraid as you are." It was the truth. The fear was a constant presence, a cold knot in her stomach. But seeing him now, seeing the resolve in his eyes, she knew it was a fear she was willing to face. Her simple world had collided with his opulent, complicated one, and she could no longer imagine them apart. He took a step towards her, closing the distance. "I don't want to hide anymore," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Not from my grief, and not from this. Not from you." He reached out and took her hands, his grip warm and strong. "I don't know what this is, or where it's going. I don't know if we have the right to it. But it's the only thing that has felt real in a very long time, and I'm not willing to let it go." His words were the anchor she had been searching for. He wasn't offering easy answers or a simple happily ever after. He was offering a partnership in the uncertainty, a promise to face the storm together. He was choosing her, with all the complications, with all the ghosts. The forced proximity had become a chosen proximity, a deliberate, conscious decision to be in this together. A wave crashed against the rocks below, sending a spray of mist into the air that felt like a baptism, a washing away of the past. They walked back to the house hand in hand, a simple act that felt like a revolution. It was a public declaration, at least to themselves, that they were no longer hiding. The staff they passed in the hallways averted their eyes, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and discretion. The news of their changing relationship would travel through the arteries of the house, a silent, powerful current. But for the first time, Elara didn't care about the judgment. The only thing that mattered was the steady, warm pressure of Kaylin's hand around hers. They ended up in the conservatory, their sanctuary. The late afternoon sun streamed through the glass panels, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and casting a golden glow on the lush foliage. The space was alive, vibrant, a testament to what they had created. It felt right to be here, in the place where their feelings had first taken root and finally bloomed. Kaylin led her to a small, secluded bench, hidden behind a wall of flowering gardenias. They sat, the intoxicating scent of the flowers enveloping them. "Seraphina sent you to me," he said quietly, looking around at the verdant life surrounding them. "I know that sounds crazy, but she knew. She knew I would build walls so high I would never find my way out. She knew I would need a guide." He turned to her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "She just didn't tell me I would fall in love with the guide." The words were a release, a validation of everything Elara had been feeling. The guilt was still there, a dull ache in the background, but it was overshadowed by the profound, overwhelming sense of love she felt for this man. He understood. He saw the impossible, beautiful, tragic complexity of their situation, and he wasn't running from it. He was giving it a name. He was calling it love. "I love you, Elara Vance," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a soft kiss to her knuckles. "I love your quiet strength, your passion for things that grow. I love the way you saw me when I was nothing but a ruin." His confession was a litany, a prayer, and it unraveled the last of her fears. The slow burn had led them here, to this moment of pure, unadulterated truth. "I love you too, Kaylin Sterling," she whispered, the words feeling like they were being pulled from the deepest part of her soul. A tear slipped down her cheek, a tear of joy, of sorrow, of a relief so profound it felt like she could finally breathe again, after months of holding her breath. He wiped the tear away with his thumb, his touch infinitely gentle. He leaned in, and this time there was no hesitation, no guilt. His kiss was soft, reverent, a promise sealed in their garden of ghosts and dreams. Their kiss was a beginning. It was the first page of a new, terrifying and beautiful chapter. As they sat together on the bench, hands entwined, a comfortable silence settled between them. The decision had been made. The love had been declared. Now, they had to face the consequences. The world outside their glass sanctuary was still there, with its judgments, its expectations, and its memories. "What do we do now?" Elara asked, her voice a whisper in the quiet of the garden. The practicalities of their situation were daunting. They were not two anonymous strangers who had fallen in love. They were Kaylin Sterling, the billionaire widower, and Elara Vance, his dead wife's best friend. Their story was a headline waiting to happen, a scandal that could hurt the memory of the woman they both loved. Kaylin squeezed her hand, his expression serious. "We do this honestly," he said, his voice firm with a newfound resolve. "No more hiding, no more secrets. We owe her that much. We owe ourselves that much." He looked around the conservatory, at the thriving life that had grown from a place of grief. "We built this. We can build a life too. It won't be easy. People will talk. But I will not dishonor what I feel for you by hiding you, or us, in the shadows." His words were a balm to her soul. The protective hero was ready to stand before the world and defend their love. It was more than she could have ever hoped for. The billionaire romance was not just about the luxury estate or the grand gestures. It was about this, the quiet strength of a man willing to fight for a future, no matter how complicated. Their forced proximity had forged a bond that was stronger than any outside judgment. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays through the conservatory, a new sense of peace settled over Elara. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with potential pain and public scrutiny. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. With Kaylin by her side, she felt like she could face anything. He was her partner, her love, her unexpected home. He stood, pulling her to her feet. He didn't kiss her. Instead, he simply held her, his arms wrapped around her in a strong, secure embrace. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. The garden they had built as a memorial to the past had become the foundation for their future. The promise she had made to her friend had been fulfilled, but in a way neither of them could have ever predicted. It had led him back to life. It had led them to each other. The question was no longer if they could love each other, but if the world would ever let them. This is the end of part 1. If you're ready for the next chapter of their story, subscribe and turn on notifications. Do you think they have a right to be happy, or is their love a betrayal? Let me know in the comments.